Greetings, everyone. Welcome to day 49, the second edition. First edition we sent out to you earlier. So today we're going to cover some things that we covered in the first edition, plus some other things, and we'll ask the question, why have the Jews gotten it wrong concerning the spring holy days, and why have the so-called Christian world gotten everything wrong concerning Sabbath and the holy days? And it's a very interesting thing. We'll begin with the Jews. So beginning with the Jews, we see this. They have the calendar correct as far as the days equate to the Roman calendar. But they have Passover wrong, Wave Sheaf Offering wrong, and Pentecost wrong. Yet they have Trumpets, Atonement, Tabernacles, Last Great Day. They have them on the right days. So how did such a thing occur when the Jews have the Hebrew scriptures? And remember, whenever they read the scriptures in the synagogue from the scrolls or whatever they have, that is the word of God that they are reading. They turn around and do exactly like the Protestants do and the Catholics do. They read things from the Bible and turn around and have their own traditions and interpretations with it. Okay? So, let's begin to answer the question. I'll just review with Numbers 9 why the Jews have a 15th Passover, when everywhere in the Bible, and even when they read it, it says the 14th. But then they interpret it because they do not properly apply the scriptures. See, whenever you interpret by your own ideas or by someone else's ideas, and you don't let the scriptures interpret the scriptures, you're going to come up wrong. Okay? So how is it that they have the 15th Passover, and yet everywhere it says the 14th? And why is it? I'm just a little review here because I covered this earlier. Why is it that the churches of God keep a 14th Passover while the Jews keep a 15th? Now, during the days of Jesus, there was a combination of both. All right? So Numbers 9, here's the problem that was confronted to the people concerning the Passover. All right, let's pick it up here. Verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children of Israel also keep the Passover at its appointed time. All right? What is the appointed time? Leviticus 23 says, these are the appointed feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. On the 14th day of the first month, between the two evenings, Bein Ha'arbaim, you shall have your Passover. Keep that in mind. We'll just put that on the shelf for just a minute here. Okay? Verse 3, in the 14th day of this month between the two evenings, that agrees with Leviticus 23, you shall keep it in its appointed time, you shall keep it according to all its statutes and according to all the ceremonies of it. And Moses spoke to the children of Israel to keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month between the two evenings in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, the children of Israel did. Now here comes a problem. Verse 6. And there were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. Now let's continue on. And those men said to him, we are defiled by the dead body of a man. Why are we kept back that we may not offer the offering of the Lord in its appointed season among the children of Israel? All right. So Moses said, you wait here. I'll find out what the Lord commands you. So here's what God commanded Moses, verse 10. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or your generations, so this is a judgment going continuously out in time, shall be unclean because of a dead body, or in a journey afar off, he shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. They shall keep it in the 14th day of the second month between the two evenings, eating it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay? Then they had the same ordinance, don't go out of the house. Now, then if someone was clean, didn't keep the Passover, they couldn't keep the second Passover. So out of this, let's put this together with several other things. Did the Jews sin and go into captivity? Yes. Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. They went off into captivity into Babylon. And it was a 20-year period that they went in 3 invasions. Okay? Now here you are in exile. You can't get back to the land of Israel because it's overrun with Gentiles now. Laid waste and desolate, like God said that would have its land Sabbath rest for 70 years. How are you going to keep the Passover? See, now let's notice also, this does not include the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Just the Passover. The answer is they could not keep it. Now, they could keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So here's what the Jews did. They said, we're going to call all the Feast of Unleavened Bread Passover. And we will have a Seder meal, which was originally the night to be much observed meal, and we will observe it with a lamb shank. Because they couldn't offer the lamb to have the whole lamb. They knew that. And because we know the whole feast, including the Passover, is 8 days, what we will do, we will add another day at the end of unleavened bread and call that the 22nd, the last day of unleavened bread. Okay? Now, when they came back out of the land, and they out of Babylon and back into the land, when God brought them back, they reverted and kept the 14th Passover, as we find in Ezra, the 6th chapter. Okay? But as more Jews came back, they brought with them the practice of a 15th Passover. And so some of the Levites were involved. Most of the priests remained faithful to the domestic 14th Passover. But the Levites and later the Pharisees, they wanted to follow the custom that was done in the diaspora or in the exile. So they said this: the Passover lambs, they misinterpreted Exodus 12, and that's why it's all in the Passover book and so forth, to mean between the two evenings is between their two interpretations. Number one, from the declining of the sun at noon. Number two, at the ninth hour, which is approximately 3 p.m. Okay? Now, one little detail that trips them up on their logic is this. Question. When were the priests to light the candles at the temple? Between the two evenings. Why do you light them? So there will be light when it's dark. Is it dark at a few minutes after noon? No. Is it dark at 3 p.m. in the afternoon? No. When does it start to get dark? When the sun goes below the horizon, and there is between the two evenings. Okay? So if they would have followed that, they would have been just fine. Okay? So part of the people kept the 14th Passover, and part of the people kept the 15th Passover. We go through all of this in the Passover book and showing that Jesus and the disciples kept the 14th. What did Jesus tell the disciples? All right? Matthew 28. And we'll come back and we'll look at something else. But let's cover this so that we will understand it, because I have recommended people, we need to follow the calculated Hebrew calendar. And then they look on the calculated Hebrew calendar, and guess what? Passover's on the 15th. And guess what else? Wave Sheaf Offering Day is wrong. And guess what else? Pentecost, with the few exceptions, maybe 1 in 6 or 1 or 8 years, Pentecost falls on the wrong day. All right? Here's what Jesus said. Now, I want you to go back and think about what Jesus commanded the apostles. What did he say concerning breaking the bread? This do in the remembrance of me. And we proved, going through the chronology in the Passover book, that they kept a 14th Passover, and they kept it in a house, did they not? Yes. Okay. What did he say concerning the wine? Do this in the remembrance of me until I come. Now the phrase is often as, we won't get into that technicality here at this point. Now, let's read here in Matthew 28, toward the end of the chapter, verse 18. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Not to Peter, not to a pope, to Jesus. Therefore go make disciples in all nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things. You might want to circle all. Okay? That I have commanded you. Did he not command them concerning the Passover? Yes, he did. And lo, I am with you always, even to the completion of the age. So how long were they to do this? Until Christ returns. Has he returned? No. All right. Now, just a little something here for the Protestants and Catholics. Since all authority had been granted to Christ in heaven and earth, any change in what Jesus taught is what? A presumption and false. So that takes care of all their communion practices. All right. Now let's come back here to Leviticus 23 and let's look at another one where the Jews have it wrong. And as I have pointed out a couple of times in the past, this was really, really tricky for one of Michael Heiss's professors of Old Testament. Okay? because he studied at the Hebrew College and also the University of Judaica. So at the University of Judaica, they're going through Leviticus 23. So let's begin here in verse 9. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you have come into the land." So they couldn't do this till they got into the land, which I give to you, and shall reap the harvest of it. Then you shall bring the premier sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the next day after the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath comes from the Hebrew ha-Shabbat. You've heard me say that before. That means the weekly Sabbath. All holy days are called Shabbats. Even in the New Testament, what happened when the Jews wanted the bodies of Jesus and the two malefactors that were with him taken down? They said, well, because it was a preparation day and a Sabbath was coming on, and that Sabbath was a high day. Okay? All right. So let's read it here. And this has the correct translation of it. Okay? On the next day, after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Then it gives all the instructions what should be waved in it. Now, verse 15. So let me ask you a question. If it is to be the next day after the weekly Sabbath, what day is that? First day of the week. Okay? Hard to figure out. Okay? Now, this is the correct translation. Michael Heiss and I went over this with a fine-tooth comb. And I don't think there is another English translation that has it this correct. And you shall count to you beginning with, not excluding. Well, that's why Worldwide Church of God, Radio Church of God had it wrong, because they started counting with Monday, the second day of the week, rather than the first day of the week. Now, I would agree with a Monday Pentecost if you can show me that Monday comes after the Sabbath. Oh, okay. All right? Can't do it. You shall count to you beginning with the next day after the Sabbath, beginning with the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Now that means each week ending with a Sabbath. Okay? That excludes partial weeks, which you would have if you started with Monday. Okay? Now let's go forward with this. Even until the day after the 7th Sabbath. Now, what is the day after the 7th Sabbath? First day of the week. You shall number 50 days, and you shall bring a new grain offering to the Lord. And it tells what it was to be. Okay? Then on the 50th day, they also did something that was not very, how should we say, it was unusual. And you, that means you all, every one, shall bring out of your homes 2 wave loaves of 2/10 parts. They shall be of fine flour, because this was the end of the harvest, 7 weeks to the harvest. Then the 50th day, they had a special offering. Okay? They shall be baked with leaven. Now, this seems to contradict what we have during the days of unleavened bread, that leaven is a type of sin. But for here, it is to be offered to God. They are the first fruits to the Lord. Everyone was to bring those 2 loaves, bring them to the priests. The priests were to bless them and wave them. And I don't know what the division of the loaves were between the priest and the people. Okay? Now, let's begin with the end of it here. We find that, let's come to the New Testament. Matthew 13. Okay, verse 33. This has to be the good use of leaven. Verse 33. Another parable he spoke to them, the kingdom of heaven is compared to leaven. Now you can't compare it to sin. This is a good use of it, which a woman took and put in 3 measures of flour until all was leavened. Now when you leaven it and bake it, you permanently change it, don't you? And that's what's going to happen at the resurrection, so this is a type of the resurrection. Okay? We're going to be changed. We'll see that tomorrow. Our vile bodies transformed, made like his glorious body. Okay? So that's the good use of leaven. Now, what about the first day of the week? Now let's come to another difficult problem concerning translation of the term ton sabbaton. That is plural for the Sabbath. Ta sabbatah in the Hebrew, very close to ha Shabbat. Okay? That's the singular weekly Sabbath. Now, when the translators were translating, and this even applies to William Tyndale, but let me tell you about William Tyndale. Let's come here to John, the 21st chapter. Okay? John 21. Now, William Tyndale, unlike the translators of today, he made a very interesting and profound statement that is in the books that were preserved by the Parker Society, which is this. He said, I know, as translators all know, that there are going to be some mistakes and refinements necessary to what I have done. And he says, I hope and pray that those following me who have the knowledge and understanding will make the corrections concerning whatever mistakes they may find. Now, when the King James translators translated the Bible, they used 95% of Tyndale's translation. Likewise with the Geneva. Geneva was a little more close. And here is the place that all of the Christian world signals as authorization for keeping Sunday. All right? And also for what they get for Easter Sunday. Now let's read it here. Verse 1. John 20. If I said 21, then we're off a chapter. Let's turn the page back. Now, on the first day of the weeks, now you will note there is an asterisk and an explanation. Okay? When you understand Leviticus 23 correctly, the use of the plural Sabbath here makes sense. And the plural Sabbath should never be applied to the weekly Sabbath. Okay? Now, they translate it on the first day of the week. Singular. But let's read it here. On the first day of the weeks. What day is that? That's the first day of counting toward Pentecost, because there are 7 weeks, each ending in a Sabbath, see? Now, on the first day of the weeks, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb, and she saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Okay? You know the rest of the story there then. Okay? Turn over here to a little bit further. Let's come to verse 14, after she asked the 2 angels, "Where did you take him?" Verse 14. After saying these things, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Thinking that he was the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." Turning around, she said to him, "Rabboni," that is to say, teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." Because he had to ascend to the Father on the Wave Sheaf Offering Day, because that's what that particular ceremony of waving the sheaf of the first fruits, because he became the first of the first fruits on the first day of counting toward Pentecost. Okay? So he was the first of the harvest. But go to my brethren and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Okay? Now, let's see what happened. Verse 19, after she told him. Afterwards, as evening was drawing near, that day, the day of the weeks, here, same way, same expression, the first day of the weeks, and the doors were shut where the disciples had assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be to you." Okay? So he ascended, came back. After that, he said, "You can touch me." But they didn't. And of course, you know that doubting Thomas was not there. All right. So, all the way through, where you find the first day It should be the first day of the weeks. The only exception is 1 Corinthians 16. Okay? First day of the weeks. Now, let's come to Acts the 20th chapter, because Acts the 20th chapter presents some difficulties to people. Acts 20. Now, Acts 20 is difficult to follow along because you have to understand the flow of events. Now, the flow of events, as we go along, I'll point out there are three distinct parties. So we'll pick them out as we go. Because when you come down here to verse 7, it says, "Now on the first day of the weeks, when the disciples had assembled to break bread, Paul preached to them." All right. The problem is verse 6. "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread." The question is, how can you have the first day of the weeks after the days of unleavened bread plus another 5 days? And so this is where one Church of God got off and said, well, whenever you have the first holy day of the days of unleavened bread begin, okay, then the Wave Sheaf Offering is not given until after the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that puts them in a bind. Now, the days of unleavened bread picture putting sin out. That's why Christ was offered and accepted by God, offered on the Passover, 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, ascended to the Father on the first day of the weeks, and that had to be always within the days of unleavened bread. Okay? So how did this happen in verse 6? Let's read it, verse 1. Okay. Now when the tumult was over, Paul called the disciples to him and embraced them, and he, singularly, left to go into Macedonia. And after passing through those parts and exhorting them with much speaking, he came to Greece. Now after he had been there 3 months, he was going to sail to Syria, but when he learned that the Jews were lying in wait for him, he decided to return through Macedonia. Now follow carefully verse 4. Now these accompanied him as far as Asia. So what he did, he left Macedonia, came across to Troas. Okay? These accompanied him as far as Asia. Sopater the Berean of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus of Derbe, Gaius and Timothy of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went ahead and waited for us in Troas. They left Paul. Paul was no longer with them. Okay? And that occurred before the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now notice, so we have two parties. We have the party, verse 4, that Paul left in Troas. We have Paul, who's the second party. Now we have the third party, which are those with Luke. Because when we read it, verse 6, but we, Now that cannot refer to the Apostle Paul. He's not included in that we statement because Philippi is in Macedonia. Paul already left Macedonia, came to Asia, and left those, and they went on into Troas to wait for the others. So let's read verse 6 here now. But we, that is those with Luke, sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So this would put it maximum 19 days after the first day of the weeks, after the Wave Sheaf Offering day. So what happened? When Paul left them up there and they went up to Troas, where did Paul go? Paul went down to where he was near Assos because he gave them instructions to pick him up at Assos. So he was there during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? He was probably there for the Passover. Now, verse 7. Now, on the first day of the weeks, Wave Sheaf Offering Day, when the disciples had assembled to break bread, that is to have a meal, Paul preached to them because he was going to leave in the morning, and he continued speaking until midnight. And then, you know, the account there were many lamps in the upper room. He was speaking on and on. The young man fell asleep, fell down from the third loft. Paul went over and said his life is still in him. And he got up. They had some more to eat, and he preached till the break of dawn, and he left. And he went to Assos. Now he stayed there and waited until the party of Luke, who then picked up the party that Paul left. So they were all together here in this case. They picked him up at Assos. All right? Verse 12. And they brought in the boy alive, and were greatly comforted. Then we went on ahead. This is Paul, not Paul, but Luke. Then we went on ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for he had so appointed, since he himself was going on foot. And after he met with us at Assos, we took him in, and we came to Mytilene. So you see the three distinct parties. So this helps solve the problem. Now, the only place, let's come here to 1 Corinthians 16, because this is where a lot of Protestants go to affirm Sunday keeping. 1 Corinthians 16. Now here we have a distinction where it should be translated first day of the week. Let's pick it up here in verse 1. Now concerning the collection that is being made for the saints, as I directed the churches in Galatia, so you also are to do. Every first day of the week. This is no church assembly. This is labor. This is harvest, having nothing to do with collecting money in a plate that is passed around by the deacons. Every first day of the week, each one is to put aside food at home. At home. Not at church. Storing up whatever he may be prospered in, so that there need not be any collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve in your letters, these are the ones I will send to carry your bounty to Jerusalem. Now you will see there very carefully, there is no church meeting, There's no passing of the plate. They're working in the field, and every first day of the week, they would bring in and store up whatever it was that they were going to send to Jerusalem. So it had absolutely nothing to do with it. Now, if the Christian world would believe what is written and what Jesus said, they should be keeping the Sabbath, but they have their own traditional Sunday keeping, and so when they read this, the first day of the weeks, they discounted the pluralness of it. See? And assumed it to be singular, and said this is justification in the New Testament for Sunday keeping. And you will see in how many have seen these little envelopes that they pass out for giving your tithes or offerings in the church that says, every first day of the week? Okay? Yes. Well, it's because of a mistranslation. That's been taken care of here. And one of the things that we have done in the Faithful Version is to correct all of these mistranslations and assumptions and traditions of men. So I hope that helps you to understand the difficulties concerning these things. Now we'll come back and we'll talk more about the meaning of day 49.